Okay, welcome everyone. So as project lead on this event, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Robert M. Butler Jack Rosenthal Age Boom Academy. When Jack and Bob started this training, there were few reporters assigned to aging as a beat, as I think you can remember. And now, as evidenced by almost 40 of you here today, there are hundreds of aging reporters, but you now cover sub-beats: aging in work, aging in health, caregiving, aging in society, and other beats. This transformation in the media speaks to the significant demographic shift we have experienced, and our topic for the next 4 sessions, caregiving in our longer lives, also comes out of this shift, as you'll hear today. I wanted to share apologies from Bruce Shapiro, who can't be with us for this session, very ironically and sadly, due to an unexpected caregiving chapter of his own, one that I very much hope will be brief, and that he'll be here in a coming session. Rich Eisenberg has stepped in to save the day. He's been a tremendous advisor throughout this planning period, and he's kindly agreed to step in so that our original agenda only has a minor adjustment. And now it gives me a lot of pleasure to welcome someone who, during a very acute caregiving chapter of my own, really walked the talk, both as an employer and as a supervisor, for which I'm very, very grateful. The director of the Columbia Aging Center and at the Age Boom Academy, my colleague and my friend, Dr. Linda Fried.
Thank you, Caitlin, and good morning, everybody. It's actually a thrill to welcome you all, to have the chance myself to welcome you all to the Age Boom Academy. As Caitlin mentioned, this academy is named for its distinguished instigators: the groundbreaking geriatrician, Dr. Robert Butler, and New York Times journalist and editorial page editor, Jack Rosenthal. The two of them came together with a preposterous idea, I guess, in the year 2000, that resulted in this Age Boom Academy, which has been conducted every year since then as an intensive seminar for journalists, editors, and producers in all media, print, radio, television, and online, so that you can help us transform to a society for longer lives based on the evidence of what's possible and what's needed, and in a way that is good for everyone. As evidenced by you, our fabulous cohort of fellows this year, the Academy remains to this day a signature project of the Butler Columbia Aging Center's International Longevity Center USA. And I'm very happy to announce that John Beard, who will be joining us in the panel shortly, is about to become the next director of the International Longevity Center. In the meantime, on behalf of our partners, the Age Boom Academy is a partnership between the Butler Columbia Aging Center and the School of Journalism. And my Age Boom co-director is Bruce Shapiro. And on Bruce's behalf, even though he isn't here right this moment, I want to really warmly welcome you to this joint annual forum in which we seek to provide you, our esteemed journalists, with new evidence about the complex health, social, and economic issues facing us as a society and facing our aging population, as well as to learn from you where sources are needed and how new stories may be told. To our fellows, I want to stress, this is an academy for you. We very much want to hear your voices and perspectives to give you what you need for the stories that should be told and to help nurture your story ideas. Before I get started, I want to thank our funders, the Retirement Research Foundation for Aging, particularly our outgoing program officer, the fabulous Nancy Zweibel, and her successor, Naomi Stanhouse, and a welcome to Amy Eisenstein if she's here. They all saw the need for this year's topic and have been working hard to address it themselves through their programs, and we're extremely grateful for their partnership, which has enabled us to bring this to you. And now to our topic. Caregiving and our longer lives falls at a timely date to focus on this because in 2 weeks, National Family Caregivers Month begins, wherein we're going to see a presidential proclamation. Last year's proclamation referred to a $145 million provision in the American Rescue Plan in support of unpaid caregivers, acknowledging that they're vital to the economy and the backbone of our health system, which of course has been made painfully obvious by the pandemic. An order of magnitude more, an unprecedented $150 billion was envisioned to support home care in the Build Back Better economic plan, which, as I think we all know, failed. But the appetite to support this backbone of home and community-based services is there and growing and is needed. We'll be looking at this more closely on the last day of the Academy with two terrific groups of panelists. So why this topic, caregiving and aging? Well, it certainly is a topic that affects all of our lives, but let's look at some of the data. In 1900, the average American could expect to live to age 47 years on average. Life expectancy in 1900 for Americans overall, and if you were African American in 1900, you could expect to live 36 years on average. By 2015, we have seen a really revolutionary demographic transformation, adding 30 years to human life expectancy and more for African Americans. Life expectancy has risen 30 years. Now, it has also dipped recently in the US and lags, even though we are doing so much better than we were, we lag behind other developed nations. How did we get here? Well, in fact, 25 of the additional 30 years of life expectancy that we've gained over the last 100 years come from our public health investments as a society, primarily through preventing disease and exposure to environmental toxins, assuring safe, healthy food and water and safe workplaces, and many other things that public health is responsible for to keep us all healthy. And our collective investment in health producing conditions, really partnering with increased education and poverty alleviation as the key components that have helped resolve disparities in the opportunity for health, what I would call having raised both the floor and the ceiling of health for everyone. 5 of our additional years of longer life come from better medical care. The evidence and the public health science we now have tells us that it would be possible to now add to that longer life more health and to actually create longer health span that approximates our now longer lifespan, thus leading to decreasing years of disability and decline before the end of our lives. However, instead of seeing this, we're seeing increased illness and disability in our later years. It doesn't have to be that way, but to get to the better option, we would need to invest significantly more in prevention of disease and disability across the life course, heavily through public health approaches for the 21st century, just as those in the 20th century made such a radical difference. Last year, we passed an unprecedented history-making milestone and have more people over 65 in the US population than under 15. That is a crossing point between age groups, which is unprecedented in history and marks the US for this year for the first time as what's formerly called an aging society, when there are more older people over 65 than under 15. By 2050, the 65 plus age group is projected to be 27% of our population. And by 2060, we expect there will be 95 million adults in the US over the age of 65, which is almost double the number over the age of 65 currently. This is a very large number. And there are tremendous upsides as well as needs associated with this aging number. And it's important to know about the upsides because I think it shapes our willingness to invest in the needs. Our long lives come with a number of assets. Over the course of our lives, we accrue knowledge, expertise, an ability to analyze problems and make decisions about what's important, no matter how complex, and to analyze and solve complex problems in a way that people are not able to do in their 20s and 30s and even 40s. Our longer lives also come with important goals that we've never had at scale before, goals that are pro-social, of people as they get older who want to make sure that future generations do well, who want to make sure, whether it's their own kids and grandkids or their community, who want to make sure that we secure a better future, who want to be generous in terms of those around them. These are tremendous assets, and they are complemented by increasing amounts of socio-emotional stability as people age, such that, and wisdom, if you will. And that combination seems to be relevant to the evidence that as people get older, they become better at conflict resolution at many different levels compared to how they could do it at younger age. So just recognizing that with our older age come a lot of assets that society's never seen before. Thinking about the fact that we will have 95 million adults over the age of 65 could be a great opportunity for society to have this kind of social capital, as well as presenting needs that have to be solved. The challenge, of course, is that instead of recognizing the opportunities that long lives could bring, instead of deploying the social capital of older adults and redesigning our society to enable people to make the contributions at older ages that they want to, we're anticipating one narrative of a perfect storm of a tsunami of challenges ensuing from this longevity. And in fact, this narrative undermines our ability to recognize the opportunity and forfeits building the approaches to both harnessing the and enabling the opportunities, as well as meeting the needs that people have as they get older. It's basically a narrative of aging as a scourge to society is not supported by the evidence and has prevented effective societal response to increased human longevity, which is a radical transformation in our population age groups. Now, there are a number of issues that underpin how we could meet the needs of an aging society, which are important to be aware of. One, of course, is the age distribution in itself and what's going on there. Since the 1960s, what we call global fertility rates, in other words, the number of children a woman has in her lifetime, global fertility rates have been cut in half globally. Currently, the US fertility rate is down to 1.8 births per woman, which is not a replacement rate. And we haven't been over the replacement rate of 2.1 births since 1973. As you may have heard from my wonderful colleague, Sarah Tom, who's here with us today, in her Big But Brief video, this decreased fertility drives the aging of the population because there are fewer young people and more old people. But it also presages a huge issue of who will care for older adults when there are fewer younger people. On average, families are smaller and there are fewer offspring to care for parents. The responsibility often falls to the women of the family, and if there are fewer, then they're not in that scenario, then that's more responsibility per woman. And the issues are particularly acute as well for the LGBTQ community, where families of choice might be thought to or enabled to step into caregiving roles. The other issue to keep in mind was one I started with, which is that our health spans currently do not line up with our increased lifespans. We're living longer, but with more ill health in the US. If we used what public health science says is possible to have long lives with long health, we would create the conditions that could deliver this to everyone. And I think we know enough how to do that. If we did it, we could compress the length of ill health, decrease it, and extend the length of our health span, and decrease the length of our disability and needs at older age. Ensuring equitable access to health through public health, which delivers the approaches for prevention and promoting health at the population and community level, and needs to be complemented by the health care for individuals that we need. And we need to have both of those across the whole life course. These approaches would enable everyone to arrive at older age healthier. So the accomplishment of healthy longevity appears to be possible. In fact, we're seeing it in the US in what I would call natural experiments, in which people who have been the beneficiaries of a lifetime of more education, living in healthier environments with better public health provision and consistent health producing opportunities and better health care are living a health span that approaches the longer length of their lives, demonstrating this is possible. But these conditions are not generally available for most Americans. But they could prevent at least half of the chronic diseases that Americans are living with. As I said, much of these benefits need to come from a reinvigorated and reinvested in public health system, which creates 70% of the health of a population. Such reinvestment and redesign for the 21st century for our longer lives would result in, the evidence would suggest, much lower healthcare needs and likely less caregiving needs. Now, we'll be talking about disparities in the opportunity for health and chronic stress associated with the provision of care later in the academy, and how this impacts not only the health of older adults, especially those of lower socioeconomic status, but also drives the widening disparities in health and disability that we're seeing and adversely affects the health of caregivers, amplifying inequities. These disparities in the opportunities of health are a driver of chronic diseases, something you'll also be hearing about throughout our academy. The greater the rates of onset of chronic disease or their incidence, the greater the need for care and the demand for caregivers. And in under-resourced families, this means the greater the demand for family caregivers who will struggle economically to juggle elder care with work because of the unaffordability of home health aides. Along with decreased fertility that I mentioned a moment ago, childbearing in the US is delayed, creating a larger age gap between parents and their adult children. This has led to the burden of caregiving for older relatives falling to people at the peak of their own careers when earning for retirement is crucial. And often this is throttling their ability to earn at this juncture, jeopardizing financial health futures of caregivers and leaving them open to precarity in their own retirement. So we have the potential, in fact, we're seeing some of the dimensions of a perfect storm. And where entitlement program policies, immigration policies, and others are all lagging behind opportunity and need. And we'll be unpacking these dimensions in our last day panels next week. You could say that the center will not hold on this. And we find ourselves faced with the need for an all-of-society approach to ensure healthy longevity and societal design that will both meet the needs and realize the opportunities of our greater life expectancy, not just for the individual, but for society as a whole. We could all gain here. The most effective, efficient solution to creating more health is public health. It's our ace in the hole. Prevention, health promotion, and the systems for equitable access to health promotion and care. We now know that prevention works at every age of life and into the oldest ages, and we need the life course approach to prevention and health promotion as a basic investment in optimizing people's opportunities for good health throughout their lives. Return on investment, if we made the investments that the science says is possible, would be very large. Now, let me formally define public health according to the National Academy of Medicine, because there are many definitions around. In this case, I'm talking about the science-based actions that are needed collectively to protect the health of the public and to prevent disease and disability and injury. For dependency in older ages, a public health approach is particularly salient to make the opportunity for longer health span the default option, and to optimize people's ability to function in the face of impairments. Rather than wearing down the health futures of informal caregivers, their own health futures, and those of the people they're caring for, we have an opportunity to build health in older ages, but we need the investments to do so. And we have the opportunity to enable continued meaning and purpose and dignity for people who need care. Both are possible. So I would argue that creating a new vision for the opportunities of an older age is the first critical step toward recognizing the benefits of our longer lives, feeling warranted optimism about those opportunities, and perhaps then amplifying a will to invest in meeting our needs. We need to recognize that as we all age, we have a range of important assets that we accrue that I mentioned before, and we need new ways to enable people to use those assets and meet their own goals to give back as they get older. For that, we're going to need to invest in research to answer many unanswered questions, like how to find and engage isolated older adults in ways that are meaningful for them and that can protect their health and function and prevent disability and dependency, and many more questions for which we don't yet have the answers. But taking these approaches of both building out the opportunities of our longer lives so individuals can live them and society can benefit, while meeting the needs of all of us as we have increased risk of ill health as we get older, could add up to a new successful stage of society, one I have called a third demographic dividend, where in fact society can flourish because we have longer lives, not despite them. Excuse me. Over the last 3 years, I had the privilege to co-chair the National Academy of Medicine's Global Commission to create a global roadmap for healthy longevity. This report was released earlier this year and is available in our digital library. Excuse me. Sorry. The Commission recognized that the rate and extent of population aging fundamentally impacts all of our futures. How families, communities, societies, industries, and economies will function. And informal caregiving is a microcosm of all of these, as we'll see over the coming days. Achieving healthy longevity cries out for optimization at these levels and is the preeminent grand challenge of this century. So much so that the National Academy of Medicine is leading a global multi-million-dollar competition and prizes to catalyze research and entrepreneurialism to extend health span in equitable ways. So the challenge we face, sorry, seem to have a dry throat. The challenge we face is not that long-lived populations are an inherent problem for society, but rather that the barriers that systematically prevent people from reaching their later years with the good health needed to thrive and to contribute to family and society, and the lack of preparation to meet the needs of people who require caregiving. It is these issues that are the challenge that we could solve. Now, the commission, the National Academy Commission, concluded that if longer lives and good health are combined with the structures needed to enable healthier older adults to be productively engaged in life, society and individuals of all ages will benefit. But we have to simultaneously match that with investing in meeting needs. We think this is ambitious, but we hope if you look at the report that we persuade you that it is doable. And we need to address 4 interdependent domains in order to that really amount to an all of society transformation, to have societies for longer lives where all can thrive. The 4 domains that need to be transformed start with what we're talking about in terms of health systems, but also include real transformation of both our physical environment and our social infrastructure, and the building of the capability for people as they age to stay engaged and involved, whether in paid work or volunteering or ongoing education or other activities that actually foster both well-being, the opportunity to give back should one desire it, and health. The commission found that our health systems were designed for a different era, still primarily a system for acute care. Yet with the demographic transition, there has also been an epidemiologic transition to a higher incidence of chronic disease. Sorry, I wasn't planning to be coughing on you. Our hospital and medical care systems are really poorly designed for the management of chronic disease, and we do not have the caregiving systems we need. So given that I keep coughing, I'm going to stop at this point with apologies to say that I invite you over the coming days to be asking the questions you need. We will do our best to give you the answers. And I invite you to discover the work of the Butler Columbia Aging Center, a university-wide center for the future of our longer lives and aging societies. I want to end by just acknowledging the people who have really been the backbone of putting this program together for you. Certainly, Caitlin Hawk, who you all already know, has the mind map of all the aging researchers throughout Columbia if you want connections. And throughout our time together, Caitlin and her event team will be here to support you. She'll be introducing them, and you'll have access to our speakers as well. And we encourage you to use the Ask Me Anything interview sessions to ask all of your best background questions in preparation for the stories you'll pursue. And a final acknowledgement goes to this A team of scientists, senior moderators, advocates, and policy shapers who, with their invaluable social capital, are doing the actual work to help families get through the crisis of caregiving and to help our society plan for a better way forward. I thank each of the distinguished speakers who will be with us throughout the Academy. And I thank all of you, our fellows, for being our partners, carrying the evidence to the public and to our policymakers. So at this point, it's my honor to turn the dialogue over to Rich Eisenberg. Rich, over to you.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Dean Freed, for the excellent, a little hopeful, a little depressing, scary keynote. Please get some water. We'll see you in a few minutes. And thank you, Caitlin, for doing everything you do and for letting me step in for Bruce Shapiro, although I can't offer his hair, I'm sorry to say. Hello, fellows. Now, I know the fellows have questions for Dean Freed about public health's role in caregiving. We're going to get to those very soon. But before we do, I thought it would be helpful if we heard from 3 of our fellows who talk a little bit about their own personal stories related to family caregiving and how they affect their beats. So first we'll have Kathy Ritchie, who's a senior field correspondent for KJZZ, the public radio station in Arizona, where she covers aging and disability related news. I had the pleasure of working with Kat at Next Avenue, where she was the health and caregiving editor. After that, we're going to hear from Dartinia Hull. She's a freelance writer, a digital media manager, social media manager in North Carolina. And then we'll hear from Carlos Ballesteros, a reporter in Chicago at Injustice Watch, which is a nonprofit investigative newsroom. So Kat, why don't you start a little bit and tell us a little about your story?
Sure. Thank you, Rich, for asking me to do this. My name is Kathy Ritchie, and I sort of got into this world by accident. I was in my mid to late 20s when my mother started to change. She was misdiagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. I started blogging about it. I was sort of trying to figure out my place in the world, sort of experiencing that quarter life crisis that many 20-something-year-olds experience. She did not exhibit any of the behaviors of Alzheimer's disease. And it was, as I was blogging, somebody had commented that her symptoms looked more like Pick's disease, which I had never heard of, which is frontotemporal degeneration. And in 2010, we received a more accurate diagnosis of that. It was a really, if you know anything about FTD, it's a very difficult disease. My mother exhibited behaviors. She was evicted from, I think, 3 facilities, assisted living facilities. She spent she had 2 stints at a geriatric psych ward, which if you've ever covered those or been to one, they're horrible places where they spend 30 days trying to stabilize your loved one with all sorts of different medications. I remember the doctor said, we tried lithium and that didn't seem to work for a few days, and it should take longer than that. And it's just really horrible. I remember finding my mother once, they had given her a Haldol shot and she was covered in her own feces. And she was sort of just left there. And I had come in after work and tried to manage that. My mother eventually ended up in a facility that was for individuals with certain behaviors. And I remember as I was filling out the paperwork, the person who was sitting me, the director, said to me, well, you really have to fail to get into this place. And I had failed. And I thought I was asking all of the right questions and doing all of the right things on behalf of my mother. I was showing up, going to these places, trying to get help. And it was really, really difficult because of her type of dementia. It's not an easy path. My mother passed away in 2014. She had fallen 2 years prior and developed pneumonia. And I think when she fell, that was really sort of the beginning of the end for her. And it did take about 2 years for her to pass away. At that point, I had an 8-month-old daughter. So I was really just trying to figure things out. I was, I think, 36 or 37 at that point. So it had been a very, very long journey. And I just didn't have the tools or the resources that are, and I find that a lot of caregivers don't, even now. There's so much more now than there was in 2008 when I started blogging about my mother's journey. And it's still, there's this disconnect that caregivers struggle with, these informal caregivers, because we're not trained to do this. And when it's your parent and you're experiencing something like dementia, it's really, really hard because you're slowly losing your parent and they're changing right before your eyes. And I hadn't heard of Dr. Pauline Boss, and I didn't know what ambiguous loss was. And the feelings that I had, like, I want this to be over with, but if it's over with, then that means my mother is dead, are totally normal. So that actually propelled me to, in some ways, to do what I do now. I joined our public radio station, KJZZ, which is a government station, in 2014. I was just looking for part-time work. I had this baby. I was dealing with the end of life of my mother. I knew it was coming. I guess I started little by little kind of writing about things that I knew or producing stories about things that I knew. And that's sort of how I got into that. That's sort of my origin story, Rich.
Thank you so much. Dartinia.
Thank you, Rich. I'm listening to Kathy and thinking about how many similarities there are in our stories. My mother is bipolar, and she decided, I don't know when she decided this, but she decided to take herself off her medication. And when she was hospitalized with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, they would not transfer her to a physical therapy ward because she was unmedicated. So they had to put her on lithium, which, yeah, for 2 or 3 days, and in order for us to get her transferred from the hospital to the physical therapy ward. And that was painful for her because she felt that she didn't need it, and I felt she didn't need it either. But going back, I'm what they call old folks youngins. I grew up with people who were 70 and older. And so people who have been older and the issues that go along with aging have always been on my periphery. When I was around 14, 15 years old, my great-grandmother, we lived with my great-grandmother, my mom and I. She began showing symptoms of dementia. And she was getting lost on her way home. She was walking outside in snowstorms with, her pajamas on. And my mom and I cobbled together a caregiving schedule where mom went to work in the morning. I went to school in the morning. I went home in the afternoon to stay until mom got home. And then mom came home and did what she had to do. And we hoped everything worked out. We hoped in the times that we weren't there, my great-grandmother was okay. But I'm in college and, you think you're going to be partying and you're bathing your great-grandmother, and she's confusing you with her sister and her mother. And her family beat the odds that we just heard. They're African American, and there were 4 siblings out of 18 who lived to be 70, 80, and 2 of them lived to be over 90. And one of them had Alzheimer's and one didn't. But we learned then that there is no in between. There was no in between. You either care for mama at home or you put mama in a home. And African Americans, we're not going to put mama in a home. And so what do? There was we lived in a little podunk, Rock Hill, South Carolina. And there was one place that this woman opened. I can't remember her name, because she thought that there needed to be something in the middle. And it was an adult day center, and we had never heard of that. And she equipped it with bright colors, and it was almost like a daycare center. It was cheerful. There was music. There was interaction. They didn't put mama in a corner. And they went to the museum, and it wasn't easy, but she did it, and it wasn't cheap. When my mother was not working and I was not at school, we were doing all of these jobs trying to make sure that my great-grandmother was able to go to this place, and we could only afford to send her 3 days a week. And that was difficult. We saw I knew how people sometimes treated mama in the streets because she is African American. I saw a lot of dismissal, I think, in the hospitals when we had to go with her. And that burned me up. I had a lot of empathy toward my older relatives because I knew the stories they had. They were the first ones to say, they didn't say global warming, but they knew that their farms were not doing what they used to do. Our farm was not producing what it used to produce.
Okay.
So that was an experience. But my most recent experience with caregiving was with my mother, who had stage 4 pancreatic cancer. And she was diagnosed. She passed away rather quickly. It was a 4-month time between when she was diagnosed and when she passed away. And in that time, I went from earning, a couple, maybe a few $1,000s a month, actually a couple thousand, with 3 or 4 part-time jobs and a lot of freelance, to earning $200 a month, because I couldn't take mama.
Put in a time cue here, Dartenia. I think we need to wrap.
I'm sorry. What we learned was we didn't know what we didn't know.
Thank you, Dartenia. And Carlos, tell us about what you are looking at.
Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Carlos Ballesteros. I'm in Chicago with Injustice Watch, a nonprofit newsroom that focuses on investigations. Quick plug for the org. We just dropped our judicial election guide. It's kind of like our bread and butter. So I invite you all to check it out at injusticewatch.org. It's a pretty cool project we always do every election cycle. And yeah, my editor told me to plug it this morning. So in terms of caregiving, I come at this topic and this beat without as much experience as the past two speakers. But recently, both my life and my work have kind of turned onto this question of aging, and particularly aging among immigrant communities. First, on the personal side, my grandma is getting up there. Thankfully, she's still very much alert and mobile and loving. And so, but at the same time, she just retired basically last month from being a home health aide, which she was for about 3 decades. And by the end, I could tell that she was tired and that she maybe didn't want to keep working, but felt she needed to for money, for her own sake. And I think it relates to a lot of this individualizing that we do of old people, older adults rather, that it is on them to take care of themselves, to be active, to find these solutions, to find these groups, blah, blah, blah. And for my grandma, that was very clear. Like she really did feel that she needed to keep going because she felt that she would be on her own at some point and she needed some money to help her out. And so it was really tough for her to retire. It was very scary for her to retire. And thankfully, my family, while not the biggest, we were able to manage to put together a caregiving schedule for her too. And so far that's going well, but it has its own challenges, like everyone else said. On the professional side, I've mostly focused my attention on the question of aging. I've mostly focused the question as it relates to undocumented older adults. Within the aging of our society here in America, immigrants are also aging as well. And the thing is, it's been 40 years, really since the Reagan amnesty in the 80s, that there's been any real chance for millions of people to naturalize their status, especially those that came without permission. And so what you have is a whole generation of immigrants who arrived in the 80s and 90s, in their 20s and 30s, who are now in their 60s and 70s without having had a chance to become citizens or residents. And so you have all the questions about having to age in America, which is a very lonely experience, a very expensive experience, coupled with the experience of being an undocumented immigrant in America, which is also lonely and frightening and expensive. And so those while my grandma is not an undocumented immigrant, she is an immigrant. And watching her make the kinds of decisions that she's had to make in her 70s really has helped me understand my work and helped me develop questions for what types of stories I want to write and about who. And so, yeah, thank you all, and excited to be here.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Kathy. And thank you, Dartinia, for sharing your personal stories. I think probably all of us have ones that we could share too if we had the time to do it. And I think we probably will do some of that over the next couple of weeks. But now I want to turn to Dean Freed. I'm hoping you're feeling better now. And maybe just start by, I'll ask one question and then I'd love to open this up to the fellows. So Dean, the National Academy of Medicine's Global Roadmap for Healthy Aging said that in 2015, on average, about 2% of health spending by OECD countries was for prevention, only 2%. And the National Academy of Medicine Global Commission for Roadmap for Healthy Longevity set a goal for 2050 for integrated public health care, social service, person-centered care, and long-term care systems. So my question for you is, what could be done right now or in the next year or two to start addressing this? And are you seeing it happening yet?
So I'm not seeing it happening, but it could happen. So what could be done? Well, I think, so I should just say as background that I'm both a geriatrician, so a physician, an internist who's specially trained in the care of older adults, clinical care of older adults, and I'm a public health professional. I'm an epidemiologist. So just as background. And so I see this from both the public health and the clinical side, as well as the long-term care side, which can fall in both many realms. I brought up public health first because this country, like most other countries, deeply underinvests in public health. And we saw the consequences of that in the pandemic. That basically in the US, we have been starving our gem of a US public health system for the last 60 years. And while I said to you that 70% of a population's health comes from what we do on the public health side, we only put 2% of our 2.5% of our dollars into public health. And unfortunately, we've been getting what we are not paying for. 97% of our huge health budget in the US goes into medical care, which of course is needed, but really only creates about 20% of what a population's health is. So I bring up public health because it is so under-recognized as a public good, and public goods tend to get underinvested in by definition. A public good that could raise the floor and the ceiling of health for everyone, and where the return on investment is very high. And I bring it up because in this moment, as we're hopefully coming out of the pandemic, and there's a lot of consternation about how, because of decades of disinvestment, the public health system did not perform adequately in the pandemic. Millions of people lost their lives, particularly older adults, people in nursing homes, and people with underlying chronic diseases. This is the moment when we need to turn to how to reinvest in a redesigned public health system. And so because that conversation is going on, I want to highlight the high value that could bring for us as societies of longer lives for all of us, and aging societies, if we could actually make the high ROI investments to keep people healthy, to keep people from getting disabled and dependent, to keep us from having more and more years of ill health as we're living longer and longer. So that is a critical part of this, and I think it is so much right now under active discussion that is a critical and perhaps highly leverageable place to start. But we need a public health system that's designed for the realities of the 21st century, and neither public health nor medical care have been redesigned for that. On the medical care side, I see there are questions, so maybe I'll stop and take questions.
Thank you. That'd be great. Yeah, please raise your hand and I will call on you as many as I can. I see Nina has a question, so why don't you start?
Hi, Nina Kekin, Vermont. I'm just curious about, Dr. Freed, you mentioned public health investments have notoriously been low. When they've been made, they've had a big return. Is there any dollar amount when you talk about some of these investments that are needed to address the needs of people over 70? How much are you talking as far as dollars that the country should be investing?
So I think at the least we should be putting 10 to 15% of our health dollars into public health, but I don't have, and I think that would be modest, but the return would be immensely high. Those analyses have not really been done and need to be done to say to you with certitude what we need. I think what we need those analyses that add into the planning on what we need from public health system for the next pandemic, for the next infectious diseases because of global warming. We need to add in what we must do to keep people healthy longer and to preserve health and functioning in old age at a community level, at a home level, and at a population level. And there are many ways that we need to go about that. But the level of investment that the US is doing leaves us with an untrained public health workforce and no design for either chronic disease prevention in most health departments or for the opportunities to improve health and function in older age, or the many other things that a public health system could provide, which include programs to identify isolated or lonely older adults and bring them into programs to solve those. Programs to protect disabled older adults in the hurricanes of climate change, or the heat emergencies of climate change, or the next pandemic, and the roles that public health should be playing in how we redesign long-term care to keep people from getting infectious diseases when the next pandemic rolls around.
Thank you, Dean. Sarah Harrison, I see you have a question.
Yeah, I wanted to ask specifically about the role of, or like sort of the treatment of neurodegenerative diseases, because while many, physically chronic illnesses, we have good treatments for them. We have good preventative strategies for them, and we have good treatments once they've been diagnosed, but neurodegenerative diseases haven't seen the same kind of progress. And so I'm curious about how we can think about, or what kinds of public health investments you think would be most effective in managing the sort of rocketing rates of Alzheimer's and dementia in particular, but also Parkinson's. I think we could put that in there.
So maybe I'll go to the stories that haven't been told or not satisfactorily. One of the things that we know is that Alzheimer's disease, which is too frequent, is actually often exacerbated by or made clinically apparent because of the coexistence of strokes. So vascular compromise of blood flow to the different parts of the brain. And stroke prevention actually has been shown, and hypertension prevention have been shown to dramatically lower the risk of dementia. So if we wanted to work on prevention, that's where we'd start, because it's low-hanging fruit. We know a lot of it. And so many of these neurodegenerative diseases are actually mixed diseases. In terms of Alzheimer's disease and other dementias, there's also a stunning statistic. So in, I think, 2014 or 15, Ken Langa and his group published a report from the Health and Retirement Survey, reporting that, which is a US representative study of US adults 50 and older. And they reported that from 2000 to 2012, there had been a 25% decline in dementia incidence in the US in older people. That is astounding, right? Now, it turns out that this was occurring particularly in a subset of the American population of older adults. And what it appears is that the people who are demonstrating this dramatic decline in dementia are people who have been the beneficiaries of a lifetime of more education, healthier environments in which the public health is protected, less pollution, and better access to the right medical care. And that combination with investments in positive environments over the life course are resulting in a dramatic decline in dementia rates in the population that's experienced that. Now, I think that that's great news, because what we need to do then is generalize those conditions to everybody from a prevention point of view. And the data indicate that the returns would be very high.
Dean, we have just 1 minute left. I'd like to ask one last public policy question before I turn this back to Caitlin. You mentioned that President Biden's Build Back Better plan had earmarked billions for long-term care, even considered part of America's infrastructure, was dropped. What does that tell you about Washington's appetite for addressing caregiving in America right now?
It tells me we need all of you to create the narratives as to how we need to shape the policies, the programs that we need for the future of all of our longer lives.
Thank you. And Caitlin, do you want to say anything before we have the 5-minute break and go to coffee rooms if we want to? I saw your note on that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. I apologize to the other fellows who have their hands up. Feel free to chat your questions and we'll get them answered. It's going to be frustrating throughout the academy that we can't get every last hand up, but we will do our best. So we're about to open several breakout rooms. These are meant for you if you want to opt in and check out your cohort and your peers. We're going to start sharp at noon. We'll just say goodbye to Dean Freed, who unfortunately can't join the next panel, but will be back later in the academy due to an urgency. Dean Freed, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Back in 5 minutes, everyone.
And those breakout rooms are open on the bottom of your screen. Feel free to click the prompt and jump into a room if you'd like to meet with any of your fellows.
Okay, we have 1 minute till we get started, everyone. All right, Nell, are the breakout rooms all closed?
Yes, we're all set.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. I'm going to hand it quickly over to Rich. We've got a really terrific table setting panel now. And I hope you all have had a chance to watch Ann Basting and Sarah Tom's Big But Brief videos. If you haven't, we'll drop the link to the Big But Brief page in the chat. But please make sure you watch those. A lot of effort and love went into them and they're great. Okay, Rich, over to you.
Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. I know breaking out is hard to do, but here we are. I won't waste the valuable time reeling off the bios of our panelists. You already have all that in your materials, but I would like to welcome Ann Basting, Sarah Tom, and John Beard, soon to be at Columbia. So Sarah, Ann, and John are each going to talk for about 5 minutes on this panel's topic, and then we're going to have a little under a half an hour where I'll be back with a few questions. Then we'll open the floor to all the fellows for questions. I promise we'll get more of them this time. Don't forget to raise your hand. So let's turn to Sarah. Sarah, why don't you start us off?
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. And I'm just going to highlight some key concepts underlying the demography to these shifts we see in caregiving, and also highlight some groups that I think are worth giving some special attention to in this transition. So the United States, like many other societies worldwide, is experiencing population aging. As Dean Freed mentioned, we see a greater percentage of the US population being comprised of older adults compared to working aged adults. And this is a concept I introduced in our first year MPH, Master Public Health course last week. We have about 400 students in that course. And one of the students asked me, but isn't it better to have problems of an aging society than to have problems of a large, rapidly growing society? And I thought that this was really a profound way of framing this discussion about aging. So in demography, I think for many years, especially through the 60s and 70s, we were concerned about population growth and the sustainability of very large populations. And while those concerns are still very relevant in some societies globally, we see the shift that in many other societies, we're thinking about this aging population. So one of the other themes that Dean Freed touched upon earlier was the main driver of this aging population is decreases in fertility. And so as we have seen worldwide decreases in infant mortality, increased educational opportunities for women, and increased women's labor force participation, we have seen this decrease in fertility. So the number of children born per woman over her lifetime. Another difference that we've seen, especially in the last 30 or 40 years, is an increase at the age of first birth. And so I think that we've all probably heard about increases in age at first birth into the mid to late 30s of highly educated women. But in fact, even women who don't have that particular profile, we've seen increases in age at first birth. And so what this creates is a greater percentage of the population of midlife people who are often at the peak of their working years, who are simultaneously providing care for children and are also family caregivers. And so you may have heard of the term sandwich generation to describe this group at the intersection of these two types of care demands. And as we heard from one of the fellows earlier this morning, is that in some cases you have even additional generations. So you might have a situation where somebody is involved with the care of both a parent and a grandparent. And so thinking of who is most impacted as a caregiver, it's often women who are providing the majority of childcare as well as family caregiving. And so I think that really some further attention as to what are the impacts of serving in both of these roles for women, and in particular, how is their own health, both their mental and physical health, impacted, and how are other aspects of their lives impacted. So some women may not have flexible working arrangements, and so they might have to take time off from work. How does that impact their long-term employment and earnings trajectories? And again, coming back to this concept of the life course, and one of the previous questions was, what can we do in terms of prevention for neurodegenerative diseases? And I think that we're seeing that there's more and more evidence showing the importance of midlife experiences for later life brain outcomes. And so while we are starting to hone in on understanding the importance of things like being able to control your blood pressure at midlife, I think there are still a lot of open questions about, but what is it that really contributes to your ability to control your blood pressure? And what are the social experiences that people are experiencing that are impacting these midlife health outcomes? And my final thought will just be to expand upon previous comments of this morning, which is to think about the diversity in terms of people providing caregiving, and to understand that there will be different individual preferences, there will be different cultural preferences for providing caregiving, and to think about how those experiences put different people at different pressures, and again, how those will impact both their current situation as well as their health and well-being later in the life course. And with that, I will pause and look forward to your questions later on.
Thank you, Anne.
Great. It's a treat to be on this panel and here with you all today. I just wanted to share a little bit about sort of how I come to this work, and then some places that I see as having a lot of untapped potential to be part of the solutions we're all looking for. My work has, as a teacher and a writer and an artist, has really centered on shifting how we think about aging and disability, and how those changes can transform the way we then experience aging and disability, and caring for someone who is greatly aged or experiencing disability. Becca Levy's work has shown us that what people think about aging most definitely impacts how they experience both the process of it, and I would add the experience of caring for someone going through it. My secret weapon is what I call storying, which is a little different than the story and the narrative that you all do. Storying is a connective and meaning-making process, building relationships and communities and building belonging by inviting another person into expression and meaning-making. It builds that sense of what Dr. Freed was talking about, of meaning and empathy and purpose. Most often when I practice it, or if you see it in practice, there is a lot of laughter and a lot of joy. Way back in 1998, I founded a nonprofit called Time Slips that actually tries to bring that approach to as many caregivers and as many different systems as possible, infusing creative care practices into care relationships and systems. So caregiving for an older adult, often, as you heard in the testimonies from the fellows, comes as a shock. It is isolating because there isn't a space or a name for it. We have caregiver, but caregiver is not a name that people take on or identify with. That it comes as a shock, it's isolating, it's exhausting. And the most common emotion, according to the Family Caregiving Alliance's Caregiving 101 module online, the most common emotion in caregiving is depression. The US relies on unpaid caregivers, but we don't do a good job at all of preparing them or supporting them. We allow negative views of aging and disability to create a hostile, isolating environment to greet them. And when they pick up, if they're able to pick up the mantle of care for a loved one. But what I've been doing is really trying to figure out what would happen if we did. What would happen and how do we prepare and support caregivers. And one of the first things I've been working on for a long time is actually going as far upstream as possible. There needs to be a dramatic expansion of service learning programs in high school and college in order to offer joyful, meaningful, not pity-based experiences with older adults. And those experiences can generate both empathy and what I call care confidence, because as that impossible landscape of care, navigating across different systems of care, which really there's a whole professional class trained to do that. Why we would expect family caregivers to understand that, I don't know. But it's the care confidence that people build up that helps them learn, this isn't right, I need an answer. Someone needs to help me find that solution. So helping young people normalize the experience of care and to understand, anticipatory and ambiguous grief, and that loss is an experience that one has across one's life that is what a lot of people experience, to normalize it and to develop care confidence. Time Slips, my work with that nonprofit is really just, we're trying to do that. I do that in my courses as well. I teach storytelling that has service learning components with it, but there's much bigger players out there and it's growing. A lot coming through the tech sector with tech investment. But I always caution that loneliness and isolation is a human solution that can be tech assisted, but it really needs to be a human solution. Secondly, we have the health sectors you've heard about and the social service sectors that are really looking at this and trying to help this challenge. A vastly underutilized sector is arts and culture. That is where meaning making and joy and beauty happen and support people across their lives in that way. And they need to be really fully engaged in this way. There's some really exciting things happening with social prescribing. Other countries have been doing it for decades now. We're just catching up in the US, which is referring people to those vibrant, growing programs in libraries and art museums that are supporting families of caregivers and really providing also respite programs for caregivers as well. Let's see. And then the final one is that we need play and joy and meaning making to be really infused into care. I've been trying to do that. It got a little sidelined by, the giant pandemic that affected older adults the most. By creating a ritualized format called an engagement party, which is a joyful way for families to try to bring loved ones back into connection and teach these very basic tools of meaning making and connection. That's all free. And really there's so much vibrancy happening. I've just come back from a Arts and Public Health convening that the University of Florida put on, and there's a lot of vibrancy and growth in this field with a lot of potential. So sort of to summarize, I would say go upstream for educating people and normalizing and boosting care confidence among young people. Teach caregivers to infuse meaning and joy into care relationships. And the arts and culture sector is there, and it's growing in its ability to be mobilized as a support system in this area.
Thank you, Anne, and thanks for all you're doing. I think what your approach is very fascinating. I hope the fellows get a chance to watch your video, which is really also great. John Beard, tell us a little bit about what you're thinking about.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. And it's great to be here. And it's actually really good to see the Academy focusing on this topic. Normally, when I talk to journalists or economists, I'm trying to convince them that aging is not an inevitable period of decline, that older people make multiple contributions to society that in fact outweigh the costs that society has to bear, and that we need to be rethinking aging and the way we frame the questions and the challenges of older age. But having said all that, there comes a time in many people's lives, maybe the last 2 or 3 years, where they lose capacity to a point where they require the care and support of others if they want to continue to live a life of meaning and dignity. And in the United States at the moment, this is done very badly, and it has repercussions for the older person. The older person themselves generally receives inadequate care, often in the place that's not really where they want to be. And I think COVID really brought home just the inadequacies of the current system in terms of the care recipients. It's bad for caregivers because, as I think Anne said, caregivers are really badly prepared. Caregiving is not an easy task, and often caregivers need to confront people with very complex conditions, very complex problems that they don't really know how to manage. And the depression that she spoke about, the stress that's placed on caregivers, is exacerbated by the fact that they have inadequate training. And it's also bad for society because the burden of caregiving is very inequitably spread. If somebody has to provide care, they may need to leave work, particularly if they're disadvantaged. And so the burden is often placed much more on disadvantaged people and on women. And women at the same time then don't have the opportunity to build up the resources so that when they require care themselves, that they can support themselves. So there are these inequities which leads to a very unfair social burden. And we know it doesn't have to be like this. There are a large number of countries in the world which actually provide comprehensive, person-centered care, and they do it in a way that's affordable for society. So we know that these systems exist, which can allow an older person who's had significant losses of capacity to continue to live a life not just of dignity, but a life of purpose and meaning, and that in doing that creates structures which actually create jobs for younger people and a care economy. So what do we have to do to achieve that? And those countries aren't necessarily Scandinavian countries. And in fact, I think there are 7 countries in the world which have universal systems of long-term care insurance, which ensures that all the care coverage that's required is delivered. And there are countries like Israel, South Korea, Japan, Germany, the Netherlands, not typically the high taxing, high sort of Scandinavian countries that people would think of. So we know it's affordable. We know that creating these systems creates a care economy, which creates jobs, because it's if you adequately train people, adequately reimburse them, and create care pathways, it creates meaningful jobs for younger people. So it's not just a negative. To achieve it, we need to think away from the frame which is often imposed on us that long-term care is institutional care, high cost, severe end of the spectrum. When people can no longer be supported in any other way, put them in an institution. In fact, we need to be thinking about long-term care much earlier in life, when people are starting to have significant losses of capacity, and that care can be provided by family in their own home. It can be provided in the community by community workers. It can be provided in residential care settings, and it can ultimately be provided in institutional care. But long-term care spans the whole lot. And we need to think about how we can integrate that, how we can ensure that the care is person-centered, so that it's not just centered around the person who's delivering it and their convenience, but is actually designed to be as meaningful as possible for the recipient. And to do that, we need to ensure that there's adequate training, even if it's a family caregiver, and providing them access with the questions that they might need answered in terms of, I have a father who's got dementia and they're displaying this behavior. What do I do about it? And also providing family caregivers with respite care, so that they can have some time off and it's not totally overwhelming for them, and linking them in with other professional caregivers to do some of the key tasks which are required. all of that caregiving, a lot of it's going to be delivered by family. Some of it can be delivered by government, and some of it can be delivered privately. So we need to be looking at how that mix can be brought together in a comprehensive way. And finally, we often think about caregiving as a terrible burden, and it can be if these supports are not in place. But I can remember in 2015, I was the lead writer for the World Report on Aging and Health at the World Health Organization. And in the Director General's office, the head of the Director General's office read it before it was published to make sure it was aligned with the organization's policies. And she said, oh, look, I really loved the report, but when you were talking about caregiving, you kept describing it as a burden. You don't know this, but about 3 or 4 years ago, I needed to take 2 years off to care for my mother who had very advanced dementia. So I couldn't work. I went there. I was basically a full-time caregiver. It was some of the most special times of my life. So don't you ever tell me it's a burden. Now, that's not to say it isn't a demand on people's lives. But if we frame this in the right way, if we provide the appropriate supports, we can create a win-win so that caregivers can have a meaningful life and the care recipient continues to have a life of meaning and dignity.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Anne and Sarah, before that. And so we're going to go to questions from fellows. Again, please raise your hand. I'll keep an eye out for it, and I'll turn to you in a second. The first question actually came from Ronnie Loveler in chat, so I'm going to read it, and I think it's really for John Beard. John, if you would help us with the answer on this one. Ronnie says, I'm interested in aspects of caregiving and who the caregivers are in small rural settings where resources are slim, population generally is lower income, lower levels of education on one level, and predominantly conservative and white. At the same time, these communities are becoming more diverse with the entry of immigrant communities who are not necessarily welcome, but are starting to fill in some of the economic gaps. She sees two very diverse sets of needs, and she doesn't know how they might be filled. So John, I wonder if you have any thoughts about rural caregiving.
I actually used to be the director of a university center for rural health, and this is a major challenge in rural areas. You don't have all the services that you can draw on in other places. Sometimes people are living in quite isolated homes. I used to be a family practitioner. I used to have an old woman who came to visit me once a month, and she said, I said, listen, there's nothing wrong with you. You don't have to come once a month. I know it's quite a hassle for you to come in here. Why don't we just see you once every 3 months? And she said, doctor, this is the only excuse I have to come to town. It's the only time I get out of the house. So please don't stop it once a month. And so you've got a lot of very isolated people, and loneliness can be a real issue too. I think the solution can come partly from the challenges which you presented. In many countries, new immigrants actually are disproportionately represented in the caregiving workforce because they're relatively low-paid jobs and relatively low-skilled. Having said that, I would hope that we would provide the skill mechanisms to support those people. So I think it's actually drawing on those resources that are coming in, looking at the other mechanisms. In France these days, they have a fantastic system where in rural France, postmen still go around, and they're very important key members of the community. They drop in on older people just to say hi, and make sure everything's okay. So thinking a little bit outside the box in terms of the resources that are available and how you might link them together. And again, trying to come up with some cohesive plan for how to do that, and where the gaps are and where you need to invest to fill those gaps, I think is important.
Thank you. Sarah Luderman, and then Jaya, and then Patty Greco. Sarah.
Hi, are there any, John, are there any resources that you would recommend to learn more about care systems in other countries that are working? I'd like to learn more about that topic.
Well, yeah, I'm not so sure about the system. There was a question earlier to Linda about the financing. And there's a good report that came out from the OECD, which looks at what people spend. In fact, there's a couple of good reports from the OECD on long-term care. That might be a good place to start, but that's not the sort of, that's the economist side, not the touchy-feely sort of care delivery side. Otherwise, I can't recommend anything. But that actually just reminds me, coming back to the question which was asked of Linda on the cost. It's interesting, in the United States, you already spend about 1.5% of GDP on long-term care. Countries which I mentioned before, like Japan, Germany, spend about 2%. It's not that much different. It's just they have a system. And a lot of the costs in the US are actually hidden because it's people, because they can't receive appropriate long-term care, end up in expensive acute care systems. And that's not calculated. So, you know, this is something that's affordable. Sorry, I know I've veered off the question, but I think it's an important point.
Thank you. Jaya.
Thank you, Richard. My question, you know, if I'm not wrong, projections of increase in aging population skew toward non-white communities. And could each one of our panelists talk a bit about what calibrations they think we need to accommodate this ethnic older adult shift?
Sarah, do you want to start?
Yeah, thanks for that point, Jaya. So if we look at a distribution by race and ethnicity across age in 2022 in the United States, the distribution for people under age 50 looks very different than the distribution of people over age 65. And so we do expect to see this growing diversity in terms of race and ethnicity for the older adult population. So I'm sorry, I lost, but did you have a specific question about, was your question about what to do about this transition?
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know that I have any magical thoughts about what to do about the transition, except to identify that I think the people providing care will have, if we think about who the working age population will look like, I think that will look different than the group of people receiving the care. And so I think that some of Anne and John's work might provide important ways to bridge these different groups of people, and also to think about opportunities for how these groups can learn from each other. So I think about my own grandmother as an example, who was still taking classes at San Francisco Community College until the age of 95. And something that she really enjoyed was being around 20-year-olds who had a very, very different experience than she did. And being able to think about, well, how are we different and how are we similar? So I think perhaps some more, as previous speakers have mentioned, some more formalized ways of doing that so that it's not just this random interaction, but that there's a more systematic way of making that happen.
Thank you. Anne, anything you'd like to add?
I actually was just going to point to both San Francisco and Los Angeles, which are communities, and New York City as well, that have just such an array of languages and cultures, and they're and really the Department of Aging in Los Angeles offering all of their services across in collaboration with arts organizations that is really addressing this. So I think some of what they're building there, one of the great challenges really does come from the rural areas. I mean, the aging populations in I think Maine is the most extreme. New Hampshire's on its heels. It's really the transportation issues of even getting people to services and places where they can engage to get support or engagement or lifelong learning. That's, to me, I see that as an increasing challenge as well. So when you layer the growing diversity with the rural challenges, there is a lot of hope, I think, from the telehealth and what opened up, I think, and accelerated and amplified the uptake of it during the pandemic. But the tech leg is still really real, and broadband is still really real. The access issues are very real. And I think it's an economic and equity issue for investment from communities as well.
Thank you. I want to turn to Patty Greco. Patty. You're on mute.
Thanks. Can you hear me now? In your big but brief, Anne, you talked about how we benefit from more collaboration between healthcare and social services, which I found very interesting. But I've also been doing some research on reporting on why it's so hard to get a dementia diagnosis, why it takes so long. And one reason I've learned, is that some physicians don't want to give the diagnosis. You know, they think, what's the point? There is no cure. And so they kind of just put it off. And of course, the longer you wait for a diagnosis, the more of a crisis it becomes, and so on. And so I guess my question is, what role do doctors play in this public health crisis? What sort of shift in mentalities do they need to have in order to have this kind of system that you're imagining and that I think sounds great and will help, which is that the healthcare system works in conjunction with social services, and who is helping to move that needle, and that's it.
I came away from that conference in Orlando the last couple of days really excited that maybe there is a chance for social prescribing in this country. And John, you can probably address it from other countries that have taken it up. And there's some great data on the impact. You know, the social determinants of health and the shift toward recognizing the impact of social determinants of health on our general health, even, you know, whatever age we are, housing and food access, but also I think the piece about loneliness, isolation, meaningfulness, you know, those things are also where we can point people and prescribe engagement. And one of the things that's exciting and happening now is, from my perspective, are the social determinants of health intakes for Medicare, Medicaid, in the annual wellness reviews, where they're asking things about loneliness. And so there's a way for older adults to get picked up without a diagnosis if we create this system for the doctors to know that there are other things and other supports that they can actually guide people to. So I think that's one of the reasons that they resist diagnoses, is there's nothing I can give them. There's no place I can point them to. So the state of Massachusetts, Culture RX, is collaborating. They're doing it across the whole life course. So some of that benefit, we may see a residual bump in like 50 years with the kids who are getting social prescribing, but down in Atlanta, SEWN, SEWN Arts and Art Pharmacy are collaborating with doctors who are hungry, because there's also just the mental health crisis in this country. There's really not a lot that they can offer as well. So they're really taking up the social prescribing for meaningful social engagement for people to alleviate particularly anxiety and depression. I really think that it can help if doctors are made aware. Cleveland Clinic is starting to do some of this as well. If doctors are made aware that there are these memory cafes with vibrant arts programs for family caregivers and the person with dementia to go to, you know, it's a lot about information sharing, so that the health network and the social service network know to point people to those programs. I don't know if that fully answered your question. I hope so.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, John. Anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I think Anne covered it very well.
Okay, great. I'm going to turn to Nora Macaluso in a second, but I just want to mention that at about 12:45 Eastern Time, we're going to switch gears a little, and Carrie Hannon, one of our mentor moderators, is joining us, and she and I are going to talk a little bit about caregiving stories. And Chris Farrell, who couldn't join us for this, sent me his notes, so I'm going to tell you some of the things he said. But Nora, what question do you have?
Part of it was just kind of answered, but I'm wondering about barriers to creating a good system like this in the US. Do insurance companies stand in the way? I know they pay more for acute care than others, or is there something else about the US healthcare system that is making it hard?
I think Nora, I think it starts how we frame and think about the problem before we think about the institutions, and that I think we frame the need for care very much from an institutional perspective. We don't think about the complex community care which can be provided, the various people who can do it, the support that can be given to them, which would make it a better system. So if you think of it as healthcare versus institutional long-term care, we're framing the issue wrong. So we have to think about it in a much more flexible way and understand that there's a continuum between what are the dominant causes of healthcare or demands on healthcare at the moment, which is chronic disease, and that chronic disease will ultimately start to impact on people's functioning, and for some to a point where they require care, and we need to be thinking about the different places where we can intervene. In terms of the insurance companies, it shouldn't be against their interests, because it's much cheaper to have somebody in supported through appropriate long-term care than to have them in acute care setting, or to have them having recurring admissions or recurring visits to the doctor. And so it's actually about trying to create care pathways which help people navigate efficiently through what is a very complex system in the United States, so that their needs are actually met rather than the needs of the provider. So there shouldn't be that pushback, but I think the pushback comes because we frame things in this very black and white, very outdated way.
Thank you. We still have time for some more questions from fellows, so feel free to raise your hand, but I will add one of my own now for Sarah. One of your primary areas of research is cognition. I wonder, how prepared do you think America's family caregivers are for assisting loved ones with dementia, and what do you think could help them?
Yeah, I think that many of the themes that John and Anne have brought up in terms of having more training for family caregivers and making that more universal, I think that those are programs that can help prepare people. I think that the landscape is continually changing with dementia and other neurodegenerative diseases. And so I think if there are somehow navigators who can help digest that information and to a useful way for family caregivers, I think that's one way to prepare people. I also think, and this concept has come up from some of the fellows' comments, but is being able to have flexibility at work in order to be a family caregiver, and again, making that more of a universal access issue, so that it's not just people who happen to have a boss who's flexible or who happen to have a specific type of job that's flexible, but really opening up that access to everybody. So I would say better some sort of caregiving access at work as a policy, and then also more expansive training for family caregivers.
Thank you.
Richard,
Carlos, please.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to say, you know, that we tend to, again, think in a very fixed way in terms of the resources that are available to us to meet these needs. And if you think in terms of low-income countries, old people there, many of them have the same needs. How on earth do you start to meet those needs in those settings? And in Asia, there's a really neat initiative that's sort of spread very widely. And I've visited places in Cambodia and in Myanmar and Vietnam, where they have a thing called older people's associations or older people's self-help groups, sometimes intergenerational self-help groups. And the idea is that you draw on the resources that are within the community, and by supporting them, they can support themselves. And so, you know, you get all the older people within the community, including the very fit and often still working ones, join the Older People's Association. And then they sit around, their blood pressure's measured, there's a few preventive actions which are sort of taken, their health promotion initiatives like physical activity. But they also then sit there and they identify the people in the community who require care and support. And you know, one of them will put up their hand and say, well, listen, I can take Rice to them 3 days a week, or listen, I can take them to the doctor because I do this, or and they sit around and they provide the care that that older person may need. At no cost to anybody, apart from the support of the Older Persons Association, which enables the capacity to be able to be delivered. And you know, you think about that when we were talking about rural areas. There's no reason why we couldn't be trying to think about how we could create similar initiatives in the United States. You don't have to live in Myanmar to be eligible to be part of an older people's association. So I mean, I think again we need to think more broadly than we traditionally do in terms of the care we can provide and who can provide it.
Thank you, John. Carlos Ballesteros has a question. Carlos?
Yeah, hey everyone. Sorry for having my camera off. My Wi-Fi is a little tricky right now. I think on that last point, John, about who's providing the care, I really do think a lot about immigrants who fill these positions as both home health aides, nurses, caregivers, etc., who fill in the gaps for those who can kind of afford this kind of a private help, you know, around the house or in medical facilities. But the question for the panel that I have is, given that the West and the US perhaps in particular is closing its borders and migrating to this country has become so much harder over the last 2 decades, how will that impact the caregiving industry? And what concerns do you all have as it relates to immigrants aging in this country in general? Thank you.
Well, I think it will have a negative impact. I mean, we've seen in the United Kingdom when they had Brexit that it became a lot harder to access the sorts of people who often fill caregiving roles, and that's been exacerbated with the economic situation as it currently stands. But having said that, I'm on the advisory board for a very large private home care delivery deliverer, and they find the majority of their caregivers are actually older people, because older people enjoy the company of other older people, and they see this as a meaningful role, and it can be quite flexibly provided. You know, a lot of caregivers, if you're talking about professional caregivers, the key thing for them is flexibility. So, you know, I think one is how we design the jobs, and there's a way we can bring people in, but definitely the less immigrants, legal and illegal, that are available, the less people there will be to fill this sort of role. But we also want to make sure that people filling these roles receive themselves adequate care and support, so it's meaningful care that they're delivering.
Thank you. So we have time for 2 more questions before we turn to Carrie and Chris and me about stories. Let me go to Betsy McKay and then Lila. I'm sorry, Ronnie, I don't have time to get to your second question this time. Betsy.
Hi, thanks. You're already talking about this, so let me just throw in there. What I'm curious about is how the workforce, the caregiving workforce has changed due to the pandemic. And, you know, I think closing or lack of immigration may be part of that, but just what concerns you all have right now about the number of people who fill caregiving roles, and kind of where are we headed at the moment?
So
Oh, I was
go
just-
ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say, Sarah, you can do the actual numbers, but I would just say, my mother has dementia, and I refer to my father's caregiving during the pandemic as caregiving in dog years, because the intensity of everything being shut down, all of somebody mentioned it on here as well, that when programmings to support people, say senior centers or memory cafes, all had to go online, and challenges of people with dementia really engaging or enjoying programming online was very difficult. The added strain, he couldn't do it anymore. And so we had to take other other choices for care that we wouldn't have necessarily had to do if there hadn't been a pandemic that exacerbated all the stress of caregiving. So I can't speak to the numbers in general, but the personal experiences, I think it's just a much greater intensity and strain on caregiving to have had to really just do it alone.
Thank you. And you may have seen in the chat, there's been some conversation about the villages movement or the village movement around the country that's doing some of this, not to be confused with the villages in Florida, which is a very different thing. Lila McClellan, you've got a question. You're on mute.
I hit the button, I swear, I just didn't go through. Anyway, thank you. I just wanted to ask about going back to the question of work, and if there are any places in the world where employers have already, accepted that caregiving, this kind of caregiving is going to be part of their employees, life, and if they provide those benefits, or I guess public resources that make it possible to leave work for an extended amount of time.
Yes, there are. I'll give you one example from Australia, and if you hadn't guessed, I'm Australian. And in fact, you can claim, it started about 20 years ago, I guess, that you could claim against your sick leave to spend care providing support to your child. And over the last 10 years or so, they've broadened that. So now that you can do it for providing care for an older person. So there are mechanisms where it can be done. And then some of these other countries I spoke about with universal long-term care insurance schemes pay the caregivers for the care that's needed to recompense them. And sometimes there are deals that are done with the employers to compensate them for the loss that they would be experiencing.
Thank you. Caitlin, I see you want to say something, please.
Yeah, I wanted to address what Ann Basting was answering and pass it back to Sarah to finish off, but just a flag for everyone that on the 19th we'll have a panel of roughly a dozen caregivers, and that availability question can come in there very much. What we're seeing is that when people of limited means do have an allotment of money to hire a caregiver, they can't compete in the marketplace for the hourly rate, and they can't give enough hours to make it worth it to the caregiver. So please bring those questions to that panel. It's going to be great, really in the trenches with people who are at bedside or in the homes. Sarah, I think maybe you could answer the demographic piece.
Yeah, so to Betsy's question, in terms of the formal healthcare sector, even before the pandemic, we had a shortage of people who were providing healthcare to older adults. I think that there's a lot of trauma and burnout among healthcare professionals in general. And I think in particular for people who care for older adults is that trauma of having a lot of people die very quickly. I think that that's still very real.
Thank you. And thank you all, panel, for your terrific insights. I want to switch gears a little now to the stories to pursue and invite Carrie Hannon to join us here. Before Carrie and I talk a little bit, I want to just mention, as you think about caregiving stories that you're going to tell, I hope you're going to sometimes take the solutions journalism approach. And that's about talking about public policies and private sector ideas that are helping, as well as some ways that some family caregivers are finding to deal with their challenges, because sometimes it's a little depressing for the audiences to only hear about the problems and not hear about the solutions. And I think these kinds of stories can help offer ideas to your audiences and maybe even to key decision makers that they may want to try some of these things. So now I want to turn to Carrie, and Chris Farrell couldn't join us, but he gave me his notes, so I'm going to read some of those. But Carrie, I wonder if you want to tell our fellows a little bit about what you think they should be thinking about it when they're looking for caregiving stories, and maybe even some stories you'd like to see.
Well, hi, everyone. It's nice to be here. For me, I come to it from an angle of work and jobs. That's what I write about, and that's what I care about a lot. I think some of the big challenges here, and I love what Rich just said, because we need to offer takeaway advice. We need to have solutions for people. It's not all doom and gloom. I think you need to seek out some of the bright lights that come through, because people learn from these success stories. That's where we get traction. And so for me, when I'm looking at it from the perspective of employment, one thing I get asked a lot is, how can I translate my caregiving experience into the workplace when I want to I'm taking this time off and now I need to get back in. How do I, use what I've been doing so don't have this big gap in my resume? So they're really good ways people can do that. But I'd love to see more examples of how people have made that jump back into the workplace and been able to articulate those challenges. I personally cared for my mom, who was 92 and had a form of dementia. And I mean, during the pandemic, we sprang her from her assisted care because she would never have understood lockdown. And it was enormously, I was hanging by a thread. It was enormously challenging. But when I think about those skills that I used, I was a patient advocate. I was a financial advisor and planner on some level. I was actually a musical director because I used to have to sing to her all the time and sing show tunes. But what I'm saying is, you have to look at the whole picture of that caregiving experience. And I think people are really, it's really hard. And as some of you mentioned already, is you walk away from a caregiving experience often very stressed out and with some trauma that lingers with you, and you need some positive messages. The second thing I love to hear about is what employers are doing. And I'm going to have a panel here next week. I think it is the 21st, if I have the date right, 20th, I'm sorry, the 20th, talking to someone who it's called eFamily Care, but Wealthy is another one that's based in New York, partly funded initially by Hearst Corporation, that really helps connect employees as an employer benefit to employees to help them with their caregiving challenges, whether it's finding a good assisted care place for someone, or if you need to go to a business meeting, even helping network you to a caregiver that can step in and help you so that you can have that opportunity. So, and even I find that big companies like Schneider Electric and stuff have benefits along these ways to really connect caregivers with employees. So we need to see more of these. And I'd like to find good examples of companies who are leading the way here. So I think, Rich, those are my two areas of what I do think truthfully coming out of the pandemic. One of the big trends that happened is that employers, because of remote work, could actually peek into our houses and see what the heck was going on. And for, I have interviewed a lot of caregivers of aging adults, and they were employees at the same time, and they were afraid to tell their bosses or managers that they were doing this because they thought it'd be a stigma. Not only was it ageism, but that they might not be around to do their jobs. And it's not like having little Timmy wanting to go to soccer practice. It's a different thing.
Thank you, Carrie. And we look forward to hearing you singing at the next panel that you're moderating for. I'll read a few of the things that Chris Farrell said on his behalf. So bear with me as I'm reading out loud. He mentions that family caregiving is one of the topics that leads to a number of rich reporting topics. He says you might interview a family about how they're caring for elderly parents or relatives, but that story can easily be broadened. He says, for example, a family caregiving story can turn into a story about housing policy and the lack of affordable options. The same can go for personal finances. And I know Bob Powell is very interested and knows quite a bit about that. Chris also says another big topic to cover is the lack of a national caregiving system. We talked a little bit about that before with Dean Freed. He says there are some interesting state experiments going on. One is in Washington State, and I just read yesterday about one going on in Maine. So you might check to see if there's anything happening in your state, or maybe to write about what's going on in some other states. Chris says the Boston Globe recently ran a long essay about a Dutch community-based system that's available to their elders and compared it to what little is being done here in the United States. Chris mentions on the issue of caregiving being a burden, excuse me, he says there's a significant group of caregivers who are thriving during caregiving, and it's giving them purpose and meaning. And that's a story that often is not getting told as often as maybe it could. He says the disturbing reality of racial disparities in long-term care is another topic that needs attention. He says you might look at departments of gerontology and aging around the country for some research on that. He also thinks, and I second this, that there's a really good topic about what are called solo agers. They used to be sometimes called elder orphans. These are people who do not have families or close friends or relatives, and yet they will need caregiving or they have to do caregiving. And what's being done to help people who don't have family members and yet need caregiving. I want to turn back to Carrie and just say, Carrie, are there stories you'd like to be seeing the fellows be thinking about doing that you haven't seen much of or any at all, and anything you want to suggest there? And then I want to throw it open to the fellows for any questions you might have for Carrie or for me about stories that you're thinking about doing or want to see.
Well, I guess, Rich, I think that the issue of personal finance is huge. I mean, it's enormously expensive if you have somebody in assisted care or what have you, and trying to game the system in a way to get anyone any benefits for your aging relative or what have you, or even if it's yourself. So I think there's a deep dive in the personal finance thing, and also you worry. The solo aging one is going to be really big moving forward, as it's not even that you don't have friends and family, it's that you might not. I know we were children. I mean, my siblings, we were caring for my mom and my dad. We were doing that. Who's going to do it for the people that don't have children? And maybe children aren't going to do it anyway. But the solo aging one is really, as our population changes, the demographics, that's going to be a big story going forward. But the personal finance one is huge. And I think Bob has a good opportunity, if he's curious, to really dig into how can we make this work somehow.
Carrie, anything you want to say about the multi-generational effect of longevity and what it means for generations who are going to be caregivers or the ones who will need caregivers? We're doing a lot of focus, I think, on people in their 50s, 60s, and 70s who are providing caregiving for their parents or spouses, but there are also millennials and Gen Z who are either doing it or going to be doing it.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot more numbers right there. Exactly. People do associate it with the 50 plus being the caregiver, but in fact, the generations coming behind the baby boomers are stepping into the game just as much. And it's something that we are not trained to do. We're not prepared to be caregivers. And I just think that any highlighting of a family situation that really makes it real for people is important. And Rich, I think it was noted too, that think of, it's not necessarily a negative thing. I was, as we heard earlier too, I found it really something magical, caring for my mom, and I never regret a minute of it. And what I needed from my employer was flexibility, and that's what people are looking for, and that's something employers need to pay attention to.
Since you still have Sarah and John and Ann here, I'd love to ask the three of you, if I can put you on the spot, are there any stories that deal with caregiving that you haven't seen that you'd like to see? Because we may have some people who could do some of that. Okay. Sarah, do you want to start?
I just, from my own personal experiences and my research experience, I think, like Carrie was saying, this intersection of work and family for people at midlife. And I would actually even back up midlife to even think about people in their 40s. And also I like this life course perspective, and really thinking about how do these different experiences in midlife, how do those impact our health and well-being in the future? And also, I really like this theme that several of you have brought up about what's working for people. And even though we think that, oh, these are groups that we would expect to have additional risks or would expect to have poor outcomes, that there are a lot of people that are doing things to have good outcomes. And so I think highlighting what those things are and how that they could be applied to other situations would be a great piece as well.
Great, thank you. Anne, anything you'd like to suggest?
I think whatever stories look at young people who have strong connections and treat that as normal. Because I think the story often goes that that's some sort of exception. I've been doing this work since my 20s, and the first question was always, why are you doing this? What sort of weird thing drew you to this work? And it makes it seem like it's an exception, and it's abnormal for young people to connect with and find meaning in relationships with or caring with older adults. And I think that does a disservice to our view, to a place where I think we need to get, which is younger people and and older people, seeing the fullness of one's life when we see a person. It's a life course perspective, but it's also a little bit different. So that's what I'd like. Intergenerational innovations that are driving the future.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, John. Dean Fried earlier on. Thank you all, fellows. Carrie, thank you so much. I'm now going to turn it back to Caitlin.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you very much. And that's a great place to end. I love that idea. I would love to see stories along those lines. So I hope for everyone, there are a lot of story ideas floating around. They'll presumably get more concrete as we proceed. This really set the table for what's to come. We were at a pretty high level today. Each of our sessions will go really deep, I think. And again, the readings and the videos will help you get even more granular. So I commend you to those resources. So on behalf of Dean Fried and Bruce Shapiro, thank you all for coming. And special thanks to Carlos, Dartinia, and Kathy for sharing earlier. And that's it. We'll see you tomorrow, same place, same time, really on time. Well, as you saw, we started right at the hour. So come just a few minutes early and we'll get you in. And we've got some important announcements to make about your Ask Me Anything interviews, which I'm sure you have questions about how you'll access them. So that'll happen at the end of tomorrow's session. Please make sure to stay on just a few minutes after we end tomorrow. And I look forward to seeing you all again tomorrow. Thank you, Rich, very much.